He stood behind the porter's desk in Albany's Union Station, shoulders draped in an olive-drab uniform that still seemed too wide for him. The spring air was cool, and the station was empty at dawn, but sweat beaded at his temples anyway. A tall white man in a suit glanced at him and cracked a silent joke with his companion, the small black porter with a tired smile. They walked on laughing softly. In the silence that followed, he folded his hands on the cart's worn handle and kept quiet. No one thought much about him. To them he was a black apron and a cap, a boy meant to haul luggage and then fade into the wood paneling. Only the rifle on his shoulder hinted at another life. They did not see the quiet fire behind his eyes or the things he had swallowed in silence. They only saw the uniform and the station floor. He had never even fired a rifle until months ago. That morning he had been cursing his luck for being stuck with the graveyard shift. Another soldier sneered at him for waiting. A boss had pushed him aside in favor of easier help. The world already saw him as small and disposable. He kept his chin high nonetheless. He was quiet, slender, 5 feet 4 inches in a uniform that made him look taller. He lacked the swagger of the passing city men, but inside he carried more pride than they could know. He closed his eyes for a second. He remembered a far-off day in Winston-Salem, scrubbing shoes under a blazing sun, a mother's hand on his shoulder telling him to hold his head high. That memory flickered and was gone. Now there was only laughter in a cold train station and a cart full of someone else's burdens. If those men truly saw him, they would see a man carrying invisible weights, years of silence, dreams of something bigger, and the fear that he was still just a black porter, waiting at the threshold of life's station. He took a slow breath and stepped forward. A train's horn blared in the distance, rattling the air. Other travelers lifted their luggage briskly, excited for destinations far away. He hoisted a sturdy trunk of his own, gloved hands steady as the owner gave him a grateful nod. The smell of polished wood and new cloth filled his nose. It felt almost luxurious. For a heartbeat, he imagined he was someone else, a man in uniform marching toward destiny instead of drudgery. But the crowd pressed in, and he vanished into routine. In that instant, he caught his reflection in a station window, dark eyes steady beneath his cap. He didn't like what he saw, and yet he could not look away. His eyes were tired and alert, the eyes of a man who had seen too much already. This was his mask now. No one here was looking for heroism. Today he was just Henry Johnson, porter. Tomorrow, well, tomorrow the world would have to learn his name. America in 1917 was a country at war with itself. To be black meant carrying extra weight everywhere, at home and abroad. Johnson had grown up knowing that. He'd seen seats in streetcars snap shut at his approach and heard whispers fall silent at the mention of his name. For him, the real battlefield began long before any shot was fired. It was in the cold glances he took from passing soldiers, in the double takes of city officials when they saw him in uniform. He realized quickly that wearing an American uniform meant less than he had hoped. The army needed men, not trust. Johnson was given old rifles and extra duties. In the drilling fields, white soldiers nudged each other and snickered if a black man's foot was out of step. They rolled their eyes and patted themselves on the back when he marched without complaint. Each day in camp felt like proving himself against an invisible enemy named prejudice. How could he be expected to fight tyranny overseas when segregation still ruled at home? He wondered this as he dug trenches beside men who accepted their uniforms better than he did his. Inside the army, the color line was drawn in orders. Johnson's 15th New York was remade into the 369th Infantry, all black and under white officers. Men whispered that it was loaned to the French because Americans didn't want to bother fighting alongside colored troops. General Pershing himself wrote a pamphlet warning the French that Negro soldiers might be unruly or worse. That cruelty stung Johnson like a slap. He was being treated as a loan, not a man. In one morning's mess hall, he saw white officers refuse to dine beside black soldiers. The French general liked Harlem's men's reliability, but the American brass still saw him as inferior. Back home, half a world away, black men faced another paradox. America desperately needed bodies for the trenches of Europe, but here its own doors remained closed. Henry had cousins in factories. They sent money home, but returned to jeers from white coworkers. Neighbors saluted his uniform politely, then slipped right back into prejudice as soon as he glanced away. Even in the base camps overseas, the color line followed him. The oldest barracks, the worst latrines, the surplus gear. He was 25, and the world treated him like a second-class soldier. In Albany, newspapers doubted soldiers like him would ever win a fight. No one expected Johnson to last at the front. Only the rifle on his shoulder hinted at another future. Yet he marched on. He learned to endure without complaint. He quietly reminded himself of his mother's words and the hunger of his past. If the army doubted him, he would carry on anyway. As the troop ship crawled out of harbor, Henry stared at the skyline one last time. The harbor lights faded behind him, and with them went half his doubts. Johnson's childhood had been little talked about, but it shaped him. Born in a poor North Carolina town, he learned early that hunger and hardship were daily teachers. As a boy, he once hid a few pennies in his shoe, a gift from a kind old farmer passing by. He remembered feeling guilty at first, then grateful as he and his siblings shared those coins over a meager meal. He never told anyone how he got them, but he learned a lesson about how kindness could arrive on an empty stomach. Poverty was an old teacher. By 13, Henry had grown tall and skinny, with serious dark eyes that missed nothing. Other boys joked about never getting enough supper. Henry didn't laugh along. He carried tools home for neighbors in exchange for food scraps. Each morsel he ate he savored like it was a feast. By night he knew enough to grin at jokes around the wood stove, trading a smile and story for a few coins or warm company. Each day he picked up lessons from everyone. A stray coin on the sidewalk, a traveler's forgotten wallet, the secrets in their hushed voices. In silence he learned what hunger and hope felt like, and made himself proud. Even as a child, Henry had not asked for a hero's life. He was tall but not athletic, quiet but not weak. Fellow black workers in Albany would come to call him Steady Henry because he was dependable. He never left shift early, never made a fuss. There was strength in his silence, as if he had built a fortress brick by brick in his mind. He had learned to stand on the sidelines, careful to see everything. A bully once shoved him in a Franklin Street alley. Henry just dusted himself off and walked away without a word. Inside him burned a stubborn pride. The world considered him small and unthreatening. They did not know he was wearing armor he had forged in secret. By the time Henry joined the 15th New York in 1917, part of him did it for his family back home. He kissed his sister goodbye in Albany, not knowing it would be the last time he saw her alive. He stepped into a new uniform, running a hand over the sturdy fabric. At least he told himself. Now he was escaping one war for another. A war in Europe, not at home. He looked at the worn boots on his feet and told himself the muddy trenches in France would judge him by action, not color. At least he hoped it wouldn't matter. He had never felt more alone than he did on that cold April night as the transport boat lumbered into Brest Harbor. His throat was raw from the bitter salt wind and hours of shouting to be heard above the engine noise. The Atlantic had nearly swallowed the ship during a storm. In the darkness he had muttered a prayer, even though he wondered, if a black man drowned at sea, would anyone on land care? He brushed the thought away. The problems waiting at home were for other men now. All Henry Johnson needed was to stay alive. The camps that followed were no sanctuary. He drilled alongside tall country boys and burly city men, learning to load rifles and throw grenades. But to Henry the real battle was often the manual labor, carrying sacks of cement, digging latrines in freezing dawn. Every morning he woke to the clamor of drills and the biting cold. His back ached under heavy loads. His hands were raw from tying knots. He lived on stale bread and cold stew, and the river of sweat on his back confirmed what he already knew. He had not come here for ease. Yet he remained steady. He slept only when officers demanded it, and always left his boots laced to the rack. By late April, he found himself posted to a lonely trench called Outpost 20 on the edge of the Argonne Forest. The daytime artillery in the distance felt far away, but out here every sound meant something. He and Private Needham Roberts, a skinny kid from New Jersey, were left in a slit trench under the open sky. The French corporal handed them rifles and helmets with a quick nod and vanished into the night. Then the forest woke. The wind hissed like snakes among the pines, and distant fox calls sounded too close for comfort. 1,000 eyes fell on them from the shadows. Johnson's rifle never left his shoulder. He and Needham took turns peering over the trench at the tree lean under the moon. Each night they shuffled out in pairs to listen along the wire, dozens of sharp ears and keen eyes straining for the slightest rattle. The wind would raise the hair on Henry's neck. He wanted to sharpen his mind beyond this patch of darkness. He kept thinking of home and hope, but also of the warm bed he'd left far behind. In this quiet, fear became a living thing around him. He had never felt more awake than he did in those hours. A faint moan of wind, a crack of twig, his body tensed at every sound. Sometimes he fingered the metal on his chest, wondering if it meant anything yet. The night was full of secrets. He told himself stories to keep the terror at bay, humming hymns from memory or counting stars beyond the branches. Whenever chance offered a distraction, he shared hardtack and water with Needham, drawing courage from the boys' nervous laughter. But mostly they waited and watched. Outside, the darkness itself held its breath. Each night on watch could have been his last ordinary moment. The seconds stretched out. Somewhere behind him, Needham whispered a quick prayer. Johnson exhaled slowly, silence coursing through his veins. He breathed in the musty air of the Argonne and willed his body to stay ready. A distant train whistle made him flinch. He rubbed the cold wood of his rifle, repeating to himself that this was just another night. He could not know how deceptive calm could be. He did not know that night would change everything. The silence shattered without warning. A metallic snip in the darkness told him everything. Someone was cutting their wire. He snapped to attention. "Grenade out!" He hissed to Needham and threw one at the dark perimeter. Then the forest erupted. Figures poured over their trench in a single wave, dozens of them howling. Grenades hissed through the air as bullets spat overhead. Johnson staggered but kept his feet. He swung his rifle like a club, smashing it into skull after skull of the attackers. The wooden butt splintered on impact, but he did not stop. He grabbed Needham's arm and dragged him down into the trench. Shrapnel exploded over their heads. Needham collapsed with a moan, wounded but alive. Johnson rushed to load another clip, but the rifle was jammed against mud. He threw it aside and pulled a dozen grenades from his belt. Then, with a steady hand, he lobbed each one out. The explosions lit faces twisted in fear and rage. A cascade of fire and steel filled the night. Men on both sides began to fall. His rifle empty, Johnson stood and charged deeper. A soldier rose out of the trench opposite him, rifle raised. Before the man could fire, Johnson was on him, a dance of shadow and steel. He slashed a long knife deep into the enemy's thigh, forcing the German back with a shriek. Another man lunged. Johnson pivoted on a knee and jabbed his blade into the man's side. The rifle bayonet whizzed past his ear. He punched the next soldier aside and dove, entangling him in the mud. He stabbed again, choking back his terror. Overhead, the war seemed to pause. The only sounds were the distant boom of artillery and the heavy breaths of two Americans in a shallow trench. Needham winced on the ground, and Johnson thought of lifting him to safety. But first he checked the bodies around. He himself was still standing. 21 wounds, he would later count. Then he remembered Needham and dragged him, injured as he was, farther back into cover. Finally, the onslaught subsided. The silence returned, heavy as the night. Johnson's heart pounded in his chest like a drum of triumph and horror. The trench was a graveyard of uniforms and spent cartridges. Dead Germans lay quiet in the mud. He looked down at Needham. The kid was alive, eyes wide with shock. Johnson slid to one knee beside him, cradling his friend's head. They were both breathing, however raggedly. He was alive, and that was all he knew for certain. His body ached and drenched in blood, but he was alive. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a dawn that would not come for hours. Johnson wiped mud and blood from his eyes. In the pale light of explosions, he realized he had held his line. He had fought alone, terrified, and he had not fallen. But as he traced Needham's forehead with trembling fingers, he felt no victory. Johnson stepped out of the trench like a ghost of himself. Mud and blood clung to his boots. His legs felt like lead. Every sound around him was dull and distant, as if he had woken from a nightmare, still inside a nightmare. He raised his head to the cold morning sky and felt rain beginning to fall, tiny taps on his bruised shoulders. The sky above the Argonne had not changed, but he was changed. He realized something then. By surviving, he had crossed a line. Something in him was different forever. He looked around at the faces of young soldiers staring in awe and confusion. They wanted to cheer him, carry him on their shoulders. He felt far away. Overhead the clouds roiled, and in that thunderless dawn he felt only exhaustion. He touched his wounded arms and bandaged head and asked himself, what is the cost of living? Johnson lowered himself to the dirty ground of no man's land. He touched the trench wall for support. He was alive, but at a terrible cost. He had stabbed down 4 enemy soldiers, saved a friend's life, and he saw that the forest around him was littered with the dark shapes of the dead. Above, the forest fell silent. The roar of battle had fled, leaving broken bodies and broken silence in its wake. When a French medic finally reached him, Johnson said nothing of his wounds. The doctor pressed a hand to Needham's leg, then to Johnson's head. Courage, he said quietly. For now, that was the first kindness Johnson had felt since he first took that trench. Johnson only nodded. He took a sip of water, tasted iron on his tongue, and did not flinch when the medic gently cleaned a gash on his cheek. He had done it. He had fought off an entire raiding party and saved Needham Roberts. Yet all around him was stillness. No one shouted bravo or lifted him on a chair. Only the rain, the bullets lodged in trees, the murmur of survivors. Henry Johnson was still alive, but something inside him had been lost. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet, feeling more alone than ever. The night had made him a legend on that field, but he felt like a stranger in that silence. Weeks later, a small ceremony was held on the damp grass of camp. Johnson found himself called forward by Colonel Hayward, who clasped his hand and said little. A French officer pinned a croix de guerre with a golden palm to Henry's uniform. It was the first real gratitude he'd felt from any uniform. Johnson bowed his head in surprise and left wordless, jewelry clattering against his chest. Around him, men clapped and yelled, brave and hero. But to him, it was all hollow noise. He was not seeking glory, only a way home. Still, the world could not let that night be forgotten. In his camp, men began whispering tales. They say Germans saw only his silhouette rushing at them and ran in terror, one messenger told him. You were a demon in that trench, another said, voice low. The stories grew like tall tales by firelight. Even German prisoners, when prodded through interpreters, offered frightened looks. They spoke of a black soldier moving through the woods, unstoppable. The French nicknamed him La Mort Noire that day, writing his deeds on papers and praising him to their superiors. Word spread quickly. In Paris, posters of Henry Johnson's face went up, a grim portrait under the Argonne moon. One American magazine splashed his name in bold, calling him the Black Death of the Argonne. The Harlem newspapers back home celebrated their son, ridiculing those who had doubted him. Boys in New York saluted his name when they heard it, proud for a moment to share a city with a legend. Soldiers in the trenches told their families in letters. The quiet porter from Albany fought like a cornered lion. Johnson heard about none of it. He kept silent. When reporters and officers asked him to describe the fight, he simply said, I did what I had to. That was true, but it was not heroic. Still, the name stuck. Men around camp started to wink when they saw him in the mess line. They slapped his back and kidded him about being a phantom soldier. He rarely laughed these days, but he answered, I'm just Henry, and stepped aside. No one believed it. Back in America, the tale of the Black Porter turned monster soldier made headlines. Patriotic rallies invoked his name, and war bond posters used his fierce image. Despite being pinned as the villain to the Germans, Even Allied audiences embraced him as their champion. He did not speak much, but in the few interviews he gave credit to chance and God, not to himself. He had become something bigger than a man. Somehow, through all the myths and medals, he felt smaller than before. When Johnson finally returned home, he was hailed as a hero by others. On Fifth Avenue in February 1919, he rode in an open car in a grand parade for the returning 369th, clutching lilies. But white and black veterans marched separately, and the crowd parted them with invisible lines. People shouted "Black Death" in awe as he passed by, and he flinched at the name they cheered. He had expected nothing from a country that had given him only a handshake in France. The army gave him no medal for his wounds, only another polite pat on the shoulder. At first, he was put on recruitment tours, a curiosity the government hoped would bring new soldiers. He told the story of that night in France again and again at churches and theaters. He mentioned, as many men like him did, the hope for a different life back home. When he spoke of Jim Crow and the cold stares he got, some in the audience fell silent. He was asked to retract those remarks and stay grateful. One recruiting sergeant finally said, "Be thankful and keep quiet," after which his tours ended. The cameras turned away from Johnson, and he was left in peace. He walked back into Albany like a stranger. Under the porter's uniform, he felt even more cramped now. His back and head still throbbed from argon. He returned to the train station where he had once blended in, but now every suitcase he lifted felt heavier. He found his old cart, set down on worn rails and chips of paint. Running it for travelers, he realized how little had changed. He had fought all night for America, but here he was still carrying luggage. He woke each morning with nightmares and the bitter taste of ashes in his mouth. The stars from the argon haunted him at home. He drank whiskey on bad nights, trying to silence the ghosts in his head. His wife, seeing only a broken stranger in his eyes, gathered their belongings and left him with their children. Before long, he had no family. Henry Johnson, hero of France, was alone with his scars. He could not hold a job. His muscles cramped and his vision blurred. He settled in slums, traded a few war stories for coins on street corners. By 1929, the soldier who had become a legend was already forgotten. The great warrior was reduced to a rumor. The man who terrified a raiding party now needed help just to find bread. He collected his medals, but they sat in a drawer like dust. The Purple Heart he had earned in blood would finally be approved only in papers years later. He never saw it. Others got pensions, the invalids and orphans, but for Johnson there was no wartime disability because he had recovered. A few friends tried to help, but he mostly curled in silence. Henry Johnson died at 32, far too young. In a cheap room, he took his last breath in January 1929, pneumonia and heartbreak his only company. There was no hero salute for him. His funeral had just a handful of mourners and a faded flag. The country that once needed his courage let him rest in quiet anonymity. He was buried as just another veteran, nothing more. For Henry Johnson, the fight never truly ended. He had served with honor and been wounded, but the prize he earned slipped from his hands. He gave his all in the Argonne and found home unwilling to give back. In the end, all he left behind was a name, whispered as legend in one land, unanswered in another. He had stood at the threshold of history and tried to step through. He held himself tall, but in the end they still left him there, outside the doors of justice, with only silence waiting inside. He had carried the title the Black Death across a battlefield, and yet in his country he remained, at most, a footnote. For years the world forgot him. He died quietly, and the only salutes he heard were in his dreams. The injustice of his story lingered still in the cold air, the weight he bore by being both savior and forgotten, still waiting for an answer.